All right, let's talk about a war named after an ear. Yep, you heard me right. It's an absolutely wild story of smuggling, political backstabbing, and how one severed body part, kept in a jar, helped kick off a massive war between two of the world's biggest empires.
I mean, it sounds like a bad joke, doesn't it? But if you go back to the 18th century, the answer was, weirdly, kind of yes. So how on earth did this one lonely ear become the official reason for a 9-year global conflict? Let's get into it.
Okay, so picture this. You're in the British House of Commons. A sea captain named Robert Jenkins steps forward. He unwraps a package and reveals his own shriveled, severed ear. He'd apparently been preserving it in a jar. In that single, very dramatic moment, it was about to change everything.
So first we have to understand the story behind this infamous ear, because this isn't just about a guy getting injured. This is the story of how that injury was transformed into a powerful and very dangerous political weapon.
Now, this timeline right here is our first huge clue. The actual incident, when a Spanish Coast Guard ship boarded his vessel and a commander sliced off his ear, that happened way back in 1731. But Jenkins doesn't show it to Parliament for 7 years. That delay is the whole story. It tells you the ear wasn't the immediate cause of the war. It was the perfect excuse, pulled out of a jar when the political moment was just right.
And this is the line that poured gasoline on the fire. These alleged words weren't just a threat to Captain Jenkins. They were a direct insult to the British king. Suddenly, this wasn't just about a sailor's ear anymore. It was a symbol of Spanish arrogance and a stain on Britain's national honor. So why was Britain so eager for a fight in 1738 that an old story about an ear was enough to set them off? Well, because the ear wasn't the real issue. It was just the spark that lit the fuse on a tinderbox of imperial rivalry that had been simmering for decades.
A huge piece of this tension was something called the Asiento de Negros. It was this incredibly lucrative contract that gave Britain the exclusive right to supply enslaved Africans to Spain's colonies. But British merchants almost immediately started abusing it, using the slave ships as a cover to smuggle tons of other illegal goods, which cheated Spain out of a fortune in taxes.
And then you had the permission ship. Britain was allowed to send exactly one merchant ship a year to Spanish ports. Just one. But they cheated. They'd use smaller boats to secretly resupply the main ship at sea, turning a single trip into a non-stop smuggling operation. As you can imagine, Spain was furious. And this just lays it out perfectly. You have two global powers with completely opposite points of view. Britain is shouting about freedom of the seas and calling Spanish patrols piracy. Meanwhile, Spain is just trying to stop rampant smuggling and enforce the law in its own territory. Both sides were absolutely convinced they were the good guys.
Okay, so you've got all this tension bubbling under the surface. Now let's see how Captain Jenkins' story was expertly used by politicians and the press to turn public anger into an overwhelming demand for war. Inside Britain, things were a mess. You had the Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, who wanted peace at all costs because it was good for the economy. But you had this opposition group, the Patriots, who saw the ear as a golden opportunity to attack Walpole, painting him as weak. And they had powerful business interests and a fired-up public on their side. Walpole made one last attempt to prevent a war. He negotiated a peace deal, the Convention of Pardo, designed to settle things with money. But the war-hungry opposition immediately shut it down, calling it a national humiliation. And here's the proof that peace was totally possible. Spain actually agreed to pay £95,000 to compensate British merchants. That's a huge sum of money. But at this point, the opposition didn't want money. They wanted a war. They wanted to get rid of Walpole and assert British power. And they got what they wanted. Walpole was forced to give in. Britain declared war, and the public went wild, celebrating in the streets with ringing bells. The public outcry, fanned by the story of a single ear, had finally pushed the nation over the edge.
Those celebrations, however, they were really short-lived. The war that followed was a brutal, costly, sprawling nightmare, fought mostly in the Caribbean, where the real enemy wasn't always the Spanish. The war actually started with a huge victory for Britain at a place called Portobello, and it made the admiral in charge a national hero. But that easy win led to massive overconfidence. The British then launched this enormous invasion of Cartagena, which turned into one of the worst military disasters in their history.
The war also spread everywhere from the coast of Georgia to the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This chart tells you the grim truth about this war. At Cartagena, the British lost over 18,000 men. But just look at that breakdown. A tiny fraction of them were actually killed in combat. The vast, overwhelming majority died from yellow fever, malaria, and other tropical diseases. The deadliest enemy wasn't a Spanish cannon, it was a mosquito. And then, as if things weren't complicated enough, a totally separate conflict blew up in Europe over who should inherit the Austrian throne. The War of Jenkins' Ear basically got swallowed up by this much bigger war, becoming just one part of a global showdown between Britain, Spain, and now France.
So after 9 years of brutal fighting, tens of thousands of deaths, and an unimaginable amount of money spent, what was the result? What was the actual legacy of the war supposedly started by an ear? And this right here is the biggest irony of the entire story. After all that fighting, the peace treaty simply put everything back to the way it was before the war started, the status quo. No territory changed hands. All that death and destruction was for, quite literally, nothing.
Which brings us back to Prime Minister Walpole's chilling prediction. When the war started, he said, "They may ring their bells now, they will be wringing their hands before long." He knew all that celebration would turn to regret, and he was proven tragically right. But the war did have some real consequences. Britain learned some very hard lessons about fighting overseas and dealing with tropical diseases. Lessons they'd use to build their empire later. Spain proved it could successfully defend its colonies. But maybe the biggest outcome was that the two empires now deeply hated each other, which just set the stage for more conflict down the road. So, to finally answer our question, no, a severed ear didn't really start a war. It was the perfect symbol. It was a human story that gave politicians the perfect spark to ignite a tinderbox that was already overflowing with economic greed and political ambition. You know, the story of Jenkins' ear is a timeless lesson in how a simple, powerful narrative can be weaponized to hide much bigger, more complex issues. And it forces us to ask ourselves a question. When we see some single emotional event dominating the news today, what are the deeper rivalries, the economic and political tensions that might be hiding just beneath the surface?